What is the possibility that such a large number of people could get across this body of water in a single night, as the biblical account demands? According to Dr. Gerald Aardsma, the portion of Lake Bardowil north of Pi Hahiroth seems easily crossed by 2 million people in a single night. While sitting in a church service recently, I happened to open my Bible to a page that showed a map of the route of the children of Israel winding their way through the wilderness after having exited Egypt. This reference map did not show just one trail marking the obvious path of the Israelites, but a total of 5 different ideas from 5 different scholars going in 5 different directions through the Sinai Peninsula. It demonstrated the Israelites crossing various proposals for the Red Sea in various locations, with ideas about the location of Mount Sinai shown literally all over the map. It looked a bit like one of those find your way through the maze puzzles I used to enjoy as a kid. I've heard it said that theories abound when none are correct. Bible students and scholars have puzzled over the route of the Exodus for centuries. Now, you can understand the inability to deduce the true route of the Exodus and the placement of these immensely important locations, such as the Red Sea crossing and Mount Sinai, a generation ago. At that time, scholars were limited by having only the text of the scriptures and the geography of the land. But with modern archaeology and the technology now available, this certainly should not be the case today. We are given quite an extensive history of these events in the books of Exodus through Joshua, including itineraries, names of locations, stopping points along the way. So it's quite stunning the degree to which scholars are stumped in trying to pinpoint the route the Israelites took on their way from Egypt to Palestine. We have been told that this event never happened. In that case, there would simply be no evidence of a massive group of people migrating out of Egypt, as the Bible speaks of, and wandering through the wilderness at the time when this was supposed to have occurred. But this is not the case. In our previous article, we demonstrated that ancient pottery has been located at various sites within the Sinai Desert, and what has been found matches what we are calling Exodus pottery. Archaeology has shown that it is right there for all to see, and it has been for a very long time, but it has been overlooked by everyone as belonging to the Israelites due to the fact that the accepted biblical chronology is off, way off. By way of review, scholars have believed that it is absolutely necessary to place the Exodus events in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, around 1450 BC. However, this actually dates the Exodus a full 1,000 years too late. All of this is due to a single copy error in 1 Kings 6:1, a vitally important passage in biblical chronology. The good news is that this has now been realized, and this error in chronology need not proceed any further. We have now seen from numerous examples that inserting 1,000 years into biblical chronology brings about the very unlikely result of the alignment of biblical history with secular history and archaeology. The bad news is that it is hard to get us humans to step out of our box of premises and preconceived ideas when they have been so firmly ingrained within us. But be that as it may, when the chronology is corrected and these events are placed in the 3rd millennium BC, 2450 BC, rather than the 2nd, a full 1,000 years earlier than the traditionally accepted dates, we suddenly see clarity instead of confusion. The extensive surface surveys that have been carried out throughout the Sinai Peninsula have actually uncovered much Exodus pottery, not only demonstrating the evidence of the mixed multitude in the wilderness, but also bringing to light the route which they took. Our goal in this video is to see if tracing this discovered pottery throughout the Sinai Peninsula will show us the actual locations of sites that the Bible mentions on the route, take us to the location of the Red Sea crossing, and eventually even lead us to the location of the true Mount Sinai. The archaeological evidence that appears with this corrected chronology shows one, and only one, correct route of the Exodus. Now let's look at an overview of the biblical account. According to Genesis 47:11, the Exodus began out of a place called Ramses. Now, this was very likely not the name of this location at the time of the Exodus, but was a name of common usage for this location at a time significantly later than the historical event. Without getting into the details here, it will suffice for now to just mention that this appears to be the case with a number of names of Old Testament places. This may also refer to a region rather than a city. The biblical account then records 3 different places where they stopped before crossing the Red Sea: Succoth, Etham, and Pi-hahiroth. While we have the names of these places recorded for us, through the years, scholars have disagreed about where they were actually located. The first location named in the Bible was Succoth, and we are not told how long they remained there. It is likely that it was not very long. The second stop, Etham, was located on the edge of the desert where water and other food sources would likely have been more available. They likely would have stayed in this area longer than in Succoth. At Etham, they were on the threshold of entering into the land of Canaan, but God did not want them entering the promised land this way because they were not yet ready for war. He was also not finished dealing with Egypt. God then instructed them to turn back and camp at the third location called Pi-hahiroth in front of the sea, where a trap was being set for the Egyptian army. We discussed previously that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Merenre-Etyemsaf II, who would have seen the Israelites turning back as a sign of them aimlessly wandering about, not knowing what they were doing. And even after all that he and his nation had been through in the plagues, he decided to round the Israelites up and bring them back into slavery. He thought he had them trapped against the water at Pi-hahiroth, but that night God sent an all-night wind which drove the waters back, and a path dried up in the sea. We are all familiar with this dramatic account of how this Pharaoh and his army chased after them, the waters then falling in on the entire Egyptian army, drowning them in the sea. After seeing such a deliverance from the true and the living God, and learning what this God was able and willing to do for them, the Israelites then turned south and head through the wilderness of Shur. Now let's look at the details of the route demonstrated by what we are calling Exodus pottery. After adjusting our dates to the corrected biblical chronology, once again we suddenly see harmony appear where before there was just complete confusion. While there's no evidence of the Exodus in the Sinai Desert in the 2nd millennium BC, things dramatically change when we look in the 3rd millennium BC. 3 clusters of sites containing what we have again labeled as Exodus pottery, dating to the 3rd millennium BC, were located along an ancient road in the northern Sinai. While archaeological surveys have been conducted throughout the Sinai Peninsula, revealing this same sort of pottery throughout the region, indicating years of wandering through the wilderness, the most important survey conducted concerning our present discussion was in the northern Sinai some decades ago, revealing these 3 clusters of sites. Let's see if these sites that were found match what we are told in the biblical account. Now here is a map demonstrating the route that the Exodus pottery reveal when placing the archaeological surveys alongside of the biblical account of the story. On this map, we are demonstrating where the archaeological data show these locations to be and the route that was taken. Marked on the map are names of the 3 initial locations where the Bible says the multitude stopped, corresponding to the 3 sites where significant clusters of pottery shards have been located. The data shown in this graph result from the work of extensive surface surveys conducted by archaeologists Eliezer Oren and Yuval Uqatili back in the 1970s, with Dr. Gerald Aardsma's identification of the Israelite encampments coinciding with the data. 3 separate clusters of sites along the ancient road connecting Egypt and Canaan are revealed by this graph. These 3 clusters correspond to the first 3 encampments of the Israelites: Succoth, Etham, and Pi-hahiroth. Let's look at each of these stopping points along the route and see how the biblical account correlates with the archaeological data. We will not go in order of events as described in the story, but in order of ease of identification of each site. So, the first location, location number 1, Etham. Etham is the most easily identified of the 3 locations, since the Bible tells us that God had the Israelites to turn back from this point. So this will be the cluster of sites where shards were located that are the furthest away from their starting point, noted as Suez on the graph. The Bible also locates Etham as on the edge of the wilderness. As we discussed previously, this is a region where food and water were more readily available. They may have stayed in Etham significantly longer than they had in Succoth. The greater number of pottery shards found there, as illustrated on our chart, suggests that this was the case. Oren and Ucatili show that the location of the furthest cluster of sites, which we are identifying as Etham, are fittingly located on the edge of the desert. Next to these unattractive conditions, there exist in the northern Sinai between Rafah and El Arish better ecological conditions that are conducive to permanent settlement and to a combination of a pastoral mode of life with rural agriculture. Our second location, location number 2, is Pi Hahiroth. The location of Pi Hahiroth is also easy to identify because the biblical account says that it is located on the shore of a sea of water. It is this sea of water that a pathway opens through as a strong wind blows through it and is crossed by 2 million people in the night. On our map, it is obvious that this is definitely the case with the leftmost cluster of sites, the one labeled as Pi Hahiroth. Oren and Ucatili marked this site BEA 34, and they describe it as, quote, one of the largest sites that they had discovered. An interesting fact about Pi Hahiroth is that the Bible describes it as located opposite Baal Zephon. Baal Zephon was an idol and landmarker of that day, and it says that this location faces Baal Zephon. The location of this Baal Zephon has been uncertain, as is the case with nearly all of these early sites. However, one candidate which has been suggested has been the location marked as Casion on our map. Casion is located on a hill on the narrow natural dam which separates Lake Bardowil from the Mediterranean Sea. So it could certainly be said that this site faces Baal Zephon and is opposite Baal Zephon if Casion is indeed Baal Zephon. Our third location is Succoth. The final cluster of sites, which is the middle cluster and would have been Israel's first stop, is Succoth. The name Succoth means booths, and was likely named this by the Israelites themselves. These booths would have been very temporary shelters made of readily available vegetation such as branches, twigs, and reeds. An implication here is that this location is far removed from any town or village of this time period, which is certainly the case with the identification of Succoth on our map. The Bible tells us that the children of Israel lived in these booths. You shall live in booths for 7 days. All the native born in Israel shall live in booths, so that your generations may know that I had the sons of Israel live in booths when I brought them out from the land of Egypt. Leviticus 23, 33 through 43. An interesting report by Oren and Ucatili states the following, quote, it looks as if the inhabitants lived in booths. Now let's talk of the crossing of the Red Sea. The Bible says that the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea in Exodus 15:22. Many have associated this Red Sea that the Bible account speaks of with what we know of as the Red Sea in the region today. However, it is incorrect to make this assumption. Many Bible translations have a marginal note that says, literally, Sea of Reeds. In Hebrew, the word is Yam Suf. Biblical scholar, Egyptologist, and historian Kenneth A. Kitchen explains, the Yam Suf would not be the Red Sea of today. The Hebrew term corresponds to Egyptian tuf, or papyrus, and should here be rendered Sea of Reeds. The body of water shown on our map next to Pi Hahiroth would be a very obvious candidate for this Yam Suf, or Sea of Reeds. Lake Bardowil, as it is known today, is a marshy saltwater lake. In the Rand McNally Bible Atlas, while discussing bodies of water in the region, Emil G. Kraling says regarding this body of water, on certain portions of this lake there are big areas of rushes, so that the name Sea of Reeds would be an appropriate designation. The lake is 45 miles long and 13 miles wide. Major C.S. Jarvis, one-time governor of Sinai, describes it as an enormous clay pan about 6 to 10 feet below the level of the Mediterranean Sea and separated from the sea by a very narrow strip of sand, 100 to 300 yards in width. As shown on this map, the Israelites crossed a portion of this lake, a sublake that is about 3 miles long. Though shallow enough to be partially emptied and dried by wind in a single night, the body of water must also be deep enough to drown Pharaoh and his army. The reported 6 to 10 foot depth of Lake Bardowil seems about perfect. What is the possibility that such a large number of people could get across this body of water in a single night, as the biblical account demands? According to Dr. Gerald Aardsma, the portion of Lake Bardowil north of Pi Hahiroth seems easily crossed by 2 million people in a single night. Dr. Aardsma states, this sublake is presently just over 3 miles across. This distance can easily be covered in 45 minutes by a person who is walking briskly. The real question, however, is whether 2 million people could funnel through the wind-dried path through this portion of the lake in time. The answer to this question depends upon how wide the wind-dried path was, which we are not told. However, to get a feel for the time needed for the Israelites to cross, first note that the sublake of Lake Bardowil, north of Pi Hahiroth, is some 3 miles wide. Assume that the middle third of this sublake was dry, making a 1 mile wide path. This leaves 1 mile wide strips of water on either side of the path to be, quote, like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. If they walked at the rate of 4 miles per hour, and each person took up an area of 6 square feet, then I calculate it would take the group roughly 52 minutes to get across. All of these factors continue to contribute to the very strong case for the events of the Exodus being found in the 3rd millennium BC rather than the 2nd millennium BC. The utter lack of archaeological evidence being found within the traditional dates has given the liberal scholar abundant proof for their case that the Exodus is merely mythological and never really happened. It has also given the conservative scholar a major headache in attempting to map the route of an event that they believe is historical but cannot find any archaeological evidence for. But as we have seen, and will continue to see, everything changes quite dramatically when we begin to look for this evidence in the correct time frame, where the correct biblical chronology tells us that it should be found. As we have mentioned previously, these articles do not answer every single question one might have concerning this new approach to biblical chronology, but my hope is that at the least it will become increasingly obvious that inserting 1,000 years into biblical chronology is doing something quite astounding, bringing clarity out of confusion. I think we are on the right road.